It was a Wednesday night, sometime past 11, when I realized how long it had been since I'd been home completely alone. My roommate had gone to visit her parents out of state for the week, and for the first time in months, the apartment was dead silent. No TV murmuring in the background, no random footsteps from her room, no kitchen noise, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old building settling. At first, I didn't mind it. I actually liked the peace. I had ordered some food earlier, did the dishes, cleaned up the living room a bit, and settled into the couch with a blanket and my phone. Outside, the street was quiet. Our apartment was on the second floor of a small 4-unit building, tucked away at the end of a narrow street lined with parked cars and half-dead trees. The kind of place that looks fine during the day but feels strangely isolated after dark. By midnight, the silence had started to feel heavier. I could hear every tiny sound, the ticking of the clock, the faint buzz from a streetlight outside the window, even the soft shifting of the floor under my feet whenever I moved. I told myself it was fine, but the longer I sat there, the more I noticed how easily my mind filled the quiet with things that weren't really there. At some point, I decided to head to bed. I turned off the living room light, went down the short hallway to my bedroom, and closed the door behind me. I didn't bother locking it. I never had before. The apartment door was locked, and the windows were shut tight. I changed into a t-shirt, plugged my phone into the charger, and scrolled aimlessly for a while before finally putting it down and turning off the lamp. It took a long time for sleep to come. Every noise from outside seemed louder than usual. A distant car engine, a dog barking, something shifting in the alleyway. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and tried to focus on my breathing. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was waking up in complete darkness to a sound that didn't fit. It was faint at first, soft enough that I thought I'd imagined it. A slow, dragging sound, coming from somewhere near the kitchen, like fabric brushing against the floor. I held my breath, waiting. The sound stopped. The silence after that felt unnatural, like the apartment was holding its breath with me. My heart was beating so fast I could feel it in my throat. I tried to tell myself it was something harmless, maybe the fridge cycling off or a draft moving something on the counter. But then I heard it again. This time it was footsteps, slow, uneven footsteps, the kind that someone makes when they're trying not to be heard. The sound came from the direction of the kitchen, then paused, then continued, slightly heavier this time. The floorboards in that part of the apartment creaked under weight, and now they were creaking one after another in a steady rhythm. Someone was in my apartment. I froze, gripping the blanket, every muscle in my body tense. I strained to hear more, praying I was wrong, but the sound was real. Whoever it was moving carefully, like they were trying to figure out if someone was awake. My first thought was that maybe I hadn't locked the front door properly. Maybe I'd been careless and someone had just walked in. The thought sent a wave of cold through me. I tried to remember if I had even checked it before going to bed. I thought I had, but I wasn't sure anymore. The footsteps grew closer. They were in the hallway now. I could picture the layout of the apartment perfectly. Kitchen to the left, small hallway in the center, my room at the end of it. Whoever was there would only need to take 5 or 6 more slow steps to reach my door. I turned my head slightly toward the door, barely breathing. There was a thin line of light under it from the streetlight outside, and after a few seconds, that light shifted, a shadow passing over it. Someone was standing right outside my room. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there, heart racing, staring at that faint strip of light and the soft shadow that interrupted it. It stayed there for several seconds, completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, muffled sound, almost like slow breathing. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen in place, listening. Every instinct in me screamed to get up and run, but I knew any movement would make noise. I didn't have a weapon, and the only thing between me and whoever was out there was a thin wooden door that wouldn't hold if they decided to open it. After what felt like a full minute, the shadow moved again. The footsteps retreated, slow, careful, like before. They moved away from my door, back down the hallway. I heard another faint creak, then silence again. I waited, afraid to even breathe too loudly. Then, faintly, I heard the sound of the refrigerator door opening. A soft suction noise followed by the quiet thud of it closing. Whoever it was wasn't leaving. They were in my kitchen. It didn't make sense. No one would break in just to open the fridge. I lay there, still and shaking, trying to decide what to do. My phone was on the nightstand. If I reached for it, the glow would give me away, but doing nothing felt worse. I slowly slid my hand out from under the blanket, moving an inch at a time until I found the phone and brought it close to my chest. I kept the screen off and listened. The sounds in the kitchen stopped again. Then there was a faint clinking, like metal utensils being shifted around. The intruder was going through drawers. That's when the floor creaked again, heavier this time, closer to the hallway. They were coming back. I tightened my grip on the phone. My pulse was so loud I could barely hear anything else. The footsteps paused right outside my door again. Then I heard something I'll never forget. The quiet, metallic sound of the doorknob moving just slightly, as if someone was testing it. That was enough for me. I slowly got up from bed, my legs trembling, and moved as quietly as I could toward the window. It was a small second-floor window that looked out onto the narrow back alley. If I jumped, I might hurt myself, but it was better than waiting in that room. I unlocked it slowly, pushing it up inch by inch. It squeaked faintly, and I froze. The doorknob stopped moving. For a few seconds, there was total silence again. Then I heard the softest sound, the faint brush of skin against the door, like someone had placed their hand flat against it. I pushed the window open all the way and climbed onto the ledge. The cold night air hit me hard, and the street below looked darker than I remembered. I hesitated only a moment before lowering myself down. The drop wasn't huge, maybe 9 feet, but I landed awkwardly on the patchy grass and stumbled, scraping my hand on the concrete. I didn't look back. I ran barefoot down the alley, around the corner, and straight toward the parking lot where my car was. I got inside, locked the doors, and sat there shaking, watching my apartment windows from a distance. I didn't see anything move. The lights stayed off. No one came out, but I couldn't make myself go back in. I drove to a nearby gas station and stayed parked there until sunrise. When I finally returned with the landlord and maintenance guy later that morning, everything looked normal. The front door was still locked. The kitchen drawers were open, and a few things had been moved. A knife missing from the block, a half-empty bottle of water on the counter that wasn't mine. But there was no one inside. The only thing that really stood out was the small bathroom window at the back of the apartment. The screen had been pushed out from the outside, and there were faint shoe prints on the sill. Someone had climbed in. They must have slipped in quietly after I went to bed. The idea that I'd been asleep while a stranger moved around in the next room still makes me sick to think about. The police came, took fingerprints, asked questions, and said it was likely a burglar who panicked when I woke up. But that explanation never felt right. Whoever it was didn't take anything valuable. They didn't seem in a rush. It felt like they'd just been exploring, moving slowly, almost testing how much they could get away with before I noticed. That night changed the way I live. I can't sleep without checking every window and door at least twice. I keep a bat by my bed. I even moved to a new place a few months later, in a building with better locks and more neighbors. But sometimes, when it's late and quiet and I hear the faint creak of old wood under my floor, that same cold feeling comes back. That heavy, paralyzing awareness that someone else might be in the same space as you, moving carefully, quietly, watching to see if you're still awake. It was a Friday night in early September when I was home alone for the first time in a long while. My parents had gone to visit relatives for the weekend, and I didn't want to tag along. I was 21, old enough to handle being by myself, and the idea of having the whole house to myself sounded peaceful. No noise, no interruptions, just quiet. Our house sat in a small, older neighborhood on the edge of town. We weren't isolated exactly, but the houses were spaced out enough that you couldn't hear your neighbors unless something loud was going on. Behind our backyard was a stretch of woods that eventually connected to a park trail. During the day, it looked normal. At night, it was just a black wall of trees. That evening, I went through my usual routine, ordered a pizza, scrolled through my phone, and turned on a show in the living room. I kept a few lights on around the house, mostly because I hated how dark it got in that neighborhood. Even with the streetlights, the corners of the yard always felt swallowed up in darkness. By the time it was almost 10, I decided to take a shower before settling in for a movie. The house felt quieter than usual. You know how when you live somewhere long enough, you get used to the hums and clicks, the fridge cycling, the water heater kicking on? That night, it felt like everything was off. The silence pressed against the walls. I went upstairs and started the shower. Steam filled the bathroom quickly, fogging up the mirror. I stood under the water longer than usual, zoning out, until I realized I'd forgotten to bring my towel from my room. Annoyed, I turned the water off and stood there dripping for a second, listening. The house was silent again, except for the faint tick of the hallway clock. I wrapped a shirt around myself and cracked the bathroom door open. The hallway was dim, the only light coming from my bedroom at the end. I stepped out, water still dripping from my hair, and walked toward my room. That's when I noticed something small. The door to the guest room across the hall was slightly open. It had been closed earlier. I was sure of it because I'd gone in there to grab extra sheets that morning. My first thought was maybe air pressure from the shower had pulled it open. But when I stopped and looked closely, I noticed that the door wasn't just cracked open. It was open enough that I could see a sliver of the bed inside. Could have sworn I'd shut it tight. I told myself not to overthink it. I went into my room, grabbed the towel and dried off. Still, the uneasiness stuck around. I left the bedroom door open, just in case, and sat down on my bed to check my phone. My Wi-Fi signal dropped for a second, not unusual, but it added to the weird tension in the air. When I looked up again, I caught my own reflection in the mirror on the wall. Behind me, the hallway was empty, but the way the shadows stretched down, it made it look deeper than it actually was. Around midnight, I went downstairs to grab a drink. The air felt heavy and still, the way it does before a thunderstorm, except the forecast had said clear skies. I poured a glass of water and leaned on the counter. The fridge motor kicked on suddenly, making me flinch. I laughed quietly to myself, realizing how jumpy I was acting. Then I heard something. It was faint, upstairs. A soft creak, like a footstep on one of the old boards near the guest room. I froze, glass in hand, and waited. Nothing. The sound didn't repeat. The air conditioner wasn't on. No windows were open. I stood there for maybe a full minute before setting the glass down. The house felt too still again. I slowly went to the bottom of the stairs and looked up. The top of the staircase was dark except for the small pool of light from my room spilling across the carpet. I couldn't see much else. I told myself it was probably the wood settling, or maybe I hadn't fully closed one of the windows earlier. I went back to the couch and turned on the TV for background noise, keeping the volume low. About 20 minutes later, I heard another sound, a sharper one this time. It wasn't from upstairs. It was from the back of the house, near the kitchen. It sounded like the faint click of a door latch. I sat up slowly and muted the TV. My pulse started thudding in my neck. I listened hard, but there was only silence again. I glanced toward the kitchen, but from where I sat, I could only see part of the counter and the top of the back door. It looked closed. I stood up quietly and grabbed the flashlight from the drawer near the entryway. I didn't turn it on yet. My heart was racing now, but I moved toward the kitchen as quietly as I could. The tile felt cold under my bare feet. When I reached the back door, I noticed something off. The bottom of the curtain over the window was moving slightly. Just a soft sway, like a breeze had brushed against it. But the door was supposed to be locked. I leaned forward, trying to listen for anything outside, but it was dead silent. That silence stretched out until I couldn't take it anymore. I switched on the flashlight and aimed it at the lock. It was still latched, but faint smudges stood out on the handle. Not fingerprints exactly, but like someone had touched it with damp or dirty hands. I stared at it for a long time. Then I turned the deadbolt again just to be sure, double-checked the front door, and went around pulling every curtain shut. The TV light flickered against the wall as I went back to the couch, but I couldn't focus on it anymore. Every creak of the house made me tense up. I realized I hadn't checked the basement door. It stayed locked most of the time, but I'd gone down there earlier in the week to grab something, and I couldn't remember if I'd locked it again. I walked over to it, flashlight in hand, and tried the handle. Locked. Still, I stared at it longer than I needed to, half expecting it to move. I decided to sleep in the living room instead of going back upstairs. I pulled the blanket off the couch and left the flashlight next to me on the coffee table. It took hours to fall asleep. Every sound made me open my eyes. The fridge cycling, the wind brushing the window, even my own heartbeat in my ears. When I finally dozed off, I woke up to faint movement again. It was around 4 a.m. The light from the street lamp outside bled faintly through the edge of the curtain, casting a narrow stripe across the floor. I didn't move, just lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, slow, deliberate creaks coming from upstairs. I knew that sound. It was the exact pattern of footsteps someone would make walking down the hall from the guest room to the top of the stairs. I held my breath and listened as they stopped. A few seconds passed. Then another faint sound, the soft click of the upstairs floorboard near the railing. I knew that creak too. It happened when you leaned your weight too far forward near the top step. Whoever, whatever, was up there was standing right at the edge. I didn't move. My throat went dry, my chest tight. I could hear my pulse roaring in my ears. After maybe 30 seconds, the sound stopped completely. I waited for what felt like an hour, though it was probably 10 minutes, before reaching for my phone. My hand was shaking as I typed in the unlock code. I turned on the flashlight again and pointed it toward the stairs. The beam barely reached the top, but the railing was empty. Nothing there. Still, I didn't go up. I sat there with my back against the wall until daylight started seeping through the windows. When it was finally light enough outside, I forced myself upstairs. Every step felt heavy. The guest room door was wide open this time. The bedspread was rumpled. The sheets pulled down like someone had sat on them. That made no sense. I hadn't been in there since the morning before. On the windowsill, I noticed fresh dirt smudges, like someone had leaned in from the outside. The screen was slightly pushed outward at the corner. I went outside around the back of the house. The ground under that window had faint footprints in the dirt. Bare, maybe from thin shoes or socks, hard to tell. They led away from the house, through the patch of grass, and toward the edge of the woods. That morning, I called a locksmith and had every lock replaced. I didn't tell my parents exactly what happened, just that I thought someone might have tried to get in. But deep down, I knew someone had been inside the house that night. Maybe they'd come through while I was showering, maybe earlier, maybe even before I'd realized I was alone. I never figured out who it was or why they picked my house. The police came later and found nothing. No forced entry, no tools, nothing stolen. But every night after that, I kept a light on in the hallway, no matter how tired I was. I started noticing small things for weeks afterward. The way the floor creaked differently, how shadows looked longer at night, how the woods behind the house never felt as empty again. I moved out 6 months later. I told myself it was just time for my own place, but the truth is, I couldn't stay there anymore. Every time I walked past that guest room door, I could still feel the air in the hall, still and heavy, like someone might be standing just around the corner, waiting for me to notice again. It was early September when we rented the old cabin near the edge of the Bitterroot National Forest. The drive there was long, quiet, and full of narrow turns through heavy trees that pressed close on both sides of the road. It had rained that morning, and by the time we reached the cabin, everything smelled damp and earthy. Pine needles, wet soil, and the faint metallic scent of rain on old wood. The place sat at the end of a dirt driveway surrounded by tall spruce trees. There were no neighbors, no visible roads, just the cabin and the forest stretching endlessly behind it. The cabin was small and old but solid dark wood floors, a single bedroom, a stone fireplace, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a front porch facing the trees and a shed sitting about 30 yards behind the house. The place had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no cable, just a radio that barely picked up any signal. It was exactly the kind of place you go to when you want to be away from everything. We brought enough supplies for 4 days. Canned food, a couple of coolers with drinks, meat, eggs, and milk, and a lot of snacks. The first day was uneventful. We unpacked, set up the sleeping bags, started a fire, and made dinner. The woods outside were quiet in a way that felt unnatural. I'd grown up camping, and there's usually at least some background noise, crickets, frogs, wind. But here there was almost nothing. The silence pressed against the walls like a living thing. That night I remember hearing small noises outside, soft cracks, faint rustling, but I brushed them off as normal forest sounds. Animals, maybe, a raccoon or a deer. I fell asleep to the sound of the fire popping and the wind moving faintly through the trees. The second day, we hiked a few miles down a trail that ran behind the cabin. It wasn't well marked, and a lot of fallen branches made it hard to follow. The deeper we went, the quieter it got, like the forest was swallowing sound. Even our footsteps seemed muffled by the damp ground. We came back in the late afternoon, tired and hungry, and made dinner on the old stove. That night, I packed the cooler full of food and drinks and left it inside, near the kitchen counter. It was a heavy-duty cooler, the kind with metal latches and a tight seal. I remember specifically locking the cabin door before bed. There were 2 locks on it, one old brass key lock and a newer bolt lock. I checked both before lying down. There were no windows open, no gaps big enough for animals to squeeze through. Felt secure. The night was colder. The fire burned low, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and wet pine. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It was faint, like something sliding or scraping softly against wood. Not constant, but just once, long and slow. Then silence again. I lay still, listening. The cabin creaked every now and then, as old buildings do, and the sound didn't repeat. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. When I woke up in the morning, the cabin was cold. Light came in faintly through the small windows, hitting the dust in the air. I went to start breakfast and reached for the cooler and froze. The lid was wide open, completely upright. The inside was empty, not just partly, completely stripped clean. Every package of food, every bottle, every piece of ice, gone. The inside was dry, no melted water, no trash, nothing, just the faint smell of what used to be there. The first thing I did was look at the door. Still locked, both bolts still in place. Windows, all closed. There was no sign of anything being forced open. No scratches, no broken glass, nothing. The floor near the cooler had faint smudges on it, like dirt or old mud, but the prints were too faint to make out any shape. I checked every inch of the cabin, but nothing else was touched. The cabinets, the bags, the backpacks, all untouched. Just the cooler, empty, lid open. I stood there for a long time just staring at it, trying to make sense of it. A raccoon couldn't have done that. A bear couldn't have gotten inside without damage. No animal could open a sealed cooler inside a locked cabin and leave no mess. The more I looked around, the less sense it made. We decided to search around the outside. The ground was soft from the previous day's rain, and near the porch steps, there were faint impressions in the mud. They weren't clear footprints, more like uneven ovals, as if someone had walked through with bare feet and half the marks had washed away. They led from the trees to the porch, stopped near the door, and then disappeared. I followed them as far as I could into the woods, but they vanished into the moss and pine needles after a few yards. All morning I kept replaying everything in my head. I knew for a fact that door had been locked. I checked it twice before bed. There was no sign anyone had broken in, but someone or something had been inside that cabin, and they hadn't taken money, electronics, or any valuables. Just food. The rest of the day I couldn't relax. Every sound outside made me tense. The forest didn't feel quiet anymore, it felt watchful, like the trees themselves were holding something back. I noticed small details that didn't register before. A cigarette but half buried near the edge of the porch, a broken twig at shoulder height near the door, the faint smell of something musky and human near the window frame. It felt like someone had been close, maybe watching us while we slept. That evening, I kept the lanterns lit longer than usual. I didn't want darkness inside. The thought of sleeping in that cabin another night made my stomach twist, but we decided to stay until morning. The nearest town was an hour's drive down winding roads, and driving those at night wasn't safe. It was hard to fall asleep. Every creak, every shift of wind outside made me sit up. Around 1 a.m., I heard something again. Soft, deliberate steps on the porch. Slow, careful. Then a faint tap like a fingertip brushing wood. I held my breath. The sound moved from one side of the porch to the other, then stopped. The silence after was unbearable. I could feel my pulse hammering in my chest, waiting for another noise that never came. When morning finally came, I went outside immediately. The porch boards were damp with dew, but near the railing, there were two faint smudges. Marks that looked like hands pressed against the wood. Not clear prints, just the suggestion of fingers. Below them, the same faint barefoot impressions led back toward the trees. We packed everything as fast as we could. I didn't even bother checking the shed or the creek. I just wanted to leave that place behind. As we loaded up the car, I noticed something strange near the back of the cabin. There was a small pile of trash, empty food wrappers, crumpled cans, and pieces of plastic. All of it was ours, the same items that had been in the cooler. They were torn open and scattered like someone had sat there eating through them one by one. The pile was about 20 yards from the cabin, half hidden behind a fallen tree. The grass around it was flattened in a rough oval, as if someone had been sitting there for a long time. I didn't go closer. I didn't want to see anything else. The drive out of those woods felt endless. The farther we got from that cabin, the lighter I felt, like some invisible weight was being peeled away. When we finally reached the main road, the world looked normal again. Open sky, sunlight, traffic. But even then, my mind kept going back to the same thought. Someone had been inside that cabin while we slept. There was no damage, no theft, no violence. Just food taken and wrappers left behind. Someone who knew how to open the door quietly, who knew where to look, and who had no interest in anything else. It was almost like they'd been living nearby, watching, waiting for a chance to eat. Later that week, I looked up the cabin's listing online and found a few old reviews buried deep in the site. One mentioned strange signs of someone staying around the property. Another said, missing food, no break-in. Nobody ever explained it further. I haven't gone back to that area since. Every time I think about that empty cooler, I imagine someone standing just outside that door, listening to us sleep, quietly letting themselves in, eating in the dark and slipping out before dawn. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a person, hungry, quiet, and close enough to touch the doorknob. It's easy to forget how alone you really are in a place like that until something reminds you. And I still wonder, even now, how many nights before ours that same person might have stood there in the dark, waiting for another unlocked door, another cooler full of food, another group that wouldn't notice until morning. It was late October when we drove up to the cabin in the mountains of northern Idaho. The drive took nearly 5 hours from the city, and by the time we reached the old gravel road that led to the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip low behind the ridges. The forest there was dense, endless rows of pine and cedar with moss-covered trunks and hardly any sound except the distant call of crows. The road was rough and narrow, just 2 strips of worn dirt cutting through the trees. Every bump made the car creak. You could tell not many people came out that way anymore. The cabin was small and old, built from dark, weathered logs that looked like they'd been standing there for decades. It sat at the base of a hill, about half a mile from a small creek that we could hear when the wind shifted. There was no cell service, no neighbors in sight, and no light from any other homes. It felt isolated in a way that was both peaceful and unnerving. We were only planning to stay for a long weekend, 3 nights, to get some quiet before winter set in. The first night was calm. We unpacked, got the wood stove going, and cooked a simple meal. The air was crisp and cold, and the smell of pine smoke filled the small cabin. I remember stepping outside before bed to breathe in the air and look at the stars. There were so many, it almost hurt to look at them. But beyond the beauty of it, there was this heavy silence. Not the kind of silence you get in the city at night, but a total absence of noise. Even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. The next morning, the sun came up gray and dull behind a thin layer of clouds. The temperature had dropped overnight, and frost covered the grass and the hood of the car. The cabin's porch creaked as I stepped out to start the generator. I walked around the side of the cabin, and the ground was soft and damp with dew. There were deer tracks near the tree line, maybe from the night before. That kind of thing didn't bother me. The woods are full of signs of life if you know where to look. We spent most of that day hiking, following an old logging trail that led up into the hills behind the cabin. The trail was narrow and uneven, and fallen branches blocked sections of it. We didn't go too far because it started getting dark early, and the woods grew colder the higher we climbed. When we got back, the air felt heavier, almost like the forest was waiting for something. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. The fire had burned down, and the only sound was the wind pressing softly against the cabin walls. I could hear something faint outside, like gravel crunching, slow, uneven. I stayed still, listening, and then it stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal wandering close to the cabin, maybe a raccoon or a deer. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I went out to the car to grab a few things, and I noticed something odd. There were marks in the dirt near the back of the vehicle. Not tire marks or animal prints. Just long, shallow scuffs, like something had been dragged. Could have been from when we unloaded, but I didn't remember dragging anything that heavy. I brushed it off, thinking I was just being paranoid, and went on with the day. We spent the second day cutting up some firewood and exploring a small clearing down near the creek. The air had that cold, metallic taste that comes before a storm, and by evening the sky was dark with clouds. When night fell, it rained steadily for hours. The sound of it on the roof was steady and loud enough to drown out everything else. When I stepped out to check the generator around midnight, I noticed the smell of gasoline faintly in the air. It wasn't leaking from the generator. It smelled more like it was coming from somewhere near the car. I shined my flashlight around but didn't see anything out of place. The rain was coming down hard enough that visibility was poor, and I didn't feel like standing out there any longer than I had to. I went back inside and tried to shake it off, but there was this growing unease that I couldn't explain. The final morning, we woke up early to pack. The sky was overcast and colorless, the kind of gray that makes the whole forest look dead. We were tired and ready to leave. I stepped outside first, loaded a few bags into the trunk, and then did a quick walk around the car out of habit. That's when I saw it. On the rear passenger tire, something shiny caught my eye. I crouched down, brushing away the dirt and wet leaves, and my stomach sank. A large nail, thick, rusty, and old, was jammed deep into the rubber. It wasn't some small nail from a construction site either. It was a long, square-headed nail, the kind used in old woodwork, almost like something from the cabin itself. The head was large, and the way it was lodged into the tire didn't look like an accident. It was driven in at an angle, deep enough that it couldn't have just fallen there. The nail hadn't been there when we arrived. I remember clearly checking the tires on the first day when we parked, because the road had so many sharp rocks and I didn't want to get stranded. The tires were fine then. I ran my hand around the others just to be sure, but that one was the only one damaged. The more I looked at it, the more it felt deliberate, like someone had placed it there, waited, and pushed it in when we wouldn't notice. The tire was flat enough that we couldn't drive far, so we had to use the spare. The process took a while because the ground was uneven and cold. As I crouched there replacing it, I noticed something else. Footprints in the mud beside the car. Not boot prints like ours. These were smaller, more narrow, and bare. You could see the outline of toes pressed into the wet ground. They led from the direction of the trees straight toward the back of the car. That was the moment everything clicked together in my head. The dragging marks I'd seen earlier, the smell of gas, the noise in the night. Someone had been around the cabin while we were asleep. Maybe more than once. Maybe watching. Maybe waiting. I felt a chill crawl down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. We didn't linger. We finished packing, threw everything in the trunk, and got into the car as fast as possible. As I backed out, I kept looking at the edge of the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the same cold, wet forest staring back. The drive back down that mountain road felt longer than the drive up. Every sound of gravel crunching under the tires made my nerves tighten. Once we hit the highway, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. But the whole ride home, I kept thinking about that nail. It wasn't random. There was no reason for a nail like that to be out there, no reason for it to end up buried deep in our tire unless someone put it there. Maybe it was some local who didn't want people coming near that cabin anymore. Maybe they'd been watching us from the woods, waiting for us to leave so they could make sure we wouldn't come back. Or maybe they had other plans if we'd stayed another night. A week later, I looked up the property online. The cabin hadn't been rented in over a year before us. The owner lived out of state and only visited once every few summers. That part of the mountain wasn't near any active homes or even campsites. Whoever was out there that weekend had no reason to be there except for us. That nail is still in my garage. I kept it after we replaced the tire. It's dark with rust, thick, and heavy. I don't know why I kept it. Maybe as proof to myself that it actually happened. Every time I look at it, I think about how easily that could have gone wrong. If the tire had gone flat on that mountain road, we would have been stuck miles from help, no service, no passing cars. And whoever had been out there watching would have known exactly where we were. The cabin looked peaceful when we first arrived. Quiet, untouched, safe. But by the time we left, I realized how vulnerable that kind of isolation really makes you. Out there, surrounded by miles of forest and silence, you don't hear someone walking up behind you. You don't hear the sound of a nail being driven into a tire. You don't hear anything until it's too late. I haven't gone back to a cabin since that trip. The memory of that morning, the cold air, the gray sky, and that nail buried deep in the rubber, never left me. It wasn't nature or bad luck that caused it. It was someone's hands, someone who wanted us stuck out there. And that thought still keeps me awake some nights, wondering how close they really got while we were sleeping. I had spent the weekend alone at a small, off-grid cabin deep in the mountains of Montana. It was something I'd been meaning to do for months, just to disconnect completely, to see if I could go a few days without my phone or any kind of noise. The cabin was old but in decent shape, a one-room structure with a cot, a wood stove, and a small table by a window that looked out toward a dense slope of pine trees. No cell service, no running water, no electricity except for a single solar lamp. It was about 5 miles from where I'd parked my truck at a small turnout off an unmarked forest road. The only access was a narrow hiking trail that wound uphill for most of the way, over roots and rocks and the occasional stream crossing. I'd arrived on Friday evening, right before sunset. The air had that early autumn bite to it, cold enough to make your breath visible, but not freezing. I spent most of that first night just getting settled, lighting the stove, unpacking my small cooler, and making sure the cabin didn't have any leaks or broken windows. It was quiet, aside from the wind pushing through the trees outside and the occasional creak from the wood settling. The stillness was comforting in a strange way. Saturday came and went slowly. I went for a few short hikes around the area, took photos, and sat out on the porch watching the shadows change as the sun moved. There wasn't much to do, and that was the point. I wanted to be bored. I wanted to feel what that kind of silence was like again. The only signs of anyone else ever being there were a few old fire pits and a faded Forest Service marker nailed to a tree nearby. That night, I cooked a simple meal and went to bed early. I woke up once in the middle of the night because of a noise outside. Not loud, but distinct. It sounded like crunching footsteps in the dry pine needles. It came and went quickly, so I assumed it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon passing by. Still, it kept me awake for a while, listening. The woods are strange at night. Your ears start making things out of nothing, and every little crack sounds closer than it really is. By morning, I decided to pack up early and head back to my truck. It was still dim when I stepped out onto the trail, the kind of gray light you get before sunrise. The forest was wet with dew, and the ground smelled like cold soil and moss. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, adjusted my jacket, and started down the path. The trail was quiet. I didn't hear any birds, which was odd. Usually there's some kind of noise, distant caws, the flap of wings, but that morning, it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. The only sound was the soft crunch of my boots on the trail and the shifting of my pack straps. After maybe 2 miles, the trail dipped through a small valley where the trees opened up slightly. I remember feeling relieved that I was making good time. The air was colder there, and I could see my breath again. That's when I saw someone else ahead of me, a hiker coming from the opposite direction, maybe 30 yards away. At first, I was surprised. I hadn't seen a single person since I'd parked my truck 2 days earlier. The man was walking at an even pace, head down, with a steady stride. He looked like any other hiker, until I noticed what he was wearing. It took me a second to process it. He had the same dark green jacket as mine, the same faded tan backpack, the same kind of hiking boots with that same scuffed patch on the right toe. Even his pants looked identical, the same color and wear marks at the knees. He moved in the same rhythm I did, the same way my arms swung when I walked. It was strange, like looking at a reflection that had come to life. I slowed my pace, thinking maybe I was imagining the similarities. The light was dim and filtered through the trees, so I thought maybe I was just seeing what I expected to see. Another hiker dressed for the cold, nothing more. But as I got closer, the resemblance became impossible to ignore. His backpack had the same brand logo, the same small tear on the right shoulder strap. I had made that tear myself last summer when a branch snagged it during a hike near Yellowstone. My stomach dropped. I stopped walking. The man looked up briefly, as if noticing me at the same time, but I couldn't make out his face clearly. It was shadowed by the brim of his hood. He didn't stop, though. He just kept walking toward me, calm, steady, like it was completely normal. I don't know why, but a cold wave of panic moved through me. There was something about the way he carried himself that felt off, like he was mimicking me. My instincts kicked in and I turned slightly, ready to step off the trail to give him room to pass. But the moment I glanced down for half a second to find my footing and looked back up, he was gone. Not in a gradual, disappearing behind a tree way, just gone. The trail stretched ahead, clear and empty. I stood there for a long time, scanning the path, the trees, the slope to the right where the trail curved. There was nowhere he could have gone without me hearing the brush move. No side trail, no sound of footsteps fading away, just silence. I told myself I must have been overtired, that maybe the dim light and the quiet had gotten into my head. It happens out there, your brain fills in shapes and people that aren't really there. I forced myself to keep walking, but I couldn't shake the unease. The woods suddenly felt heavier. Every sound, every shift of wind through the branches made me tense up. As I got closer to where I'd parked, the ground started to get muddier. It had rained a little overnight, leaving patches of soft earth that clearly showed footprints. I could see my own tracks from when I'd hiked in 2 days earlier, deep prints heading toward the cabin. I followed them automatically, half comforted by the idea that I could trace my steps back. But then I noticed something that made me stop cold. There were other prints alongside mine, fresh ones, the same boot tread as mine, same size, same spacing, but they were pressed on top of my older prints, newer, clearer, more defined. They followed right behind mine for as far as I could see. Sometimes they overlapped almost perfectly, like whoever had made them had been stepping exactly where I had before. My first thought was that maybe someone had come up the trail after me, another hiker wearing similar gear, but the tracks followed every turn, every uneven rock, every side step I'd taken to avoid puddles. The pattern matched my gait, stride for stride, like someone had studied the way I walked and repeated it. I crouched down to look closer. The prints were fresh, maybe an hour old at most. The edges were sharp, the soil still damp inside them. Whoever had made them had been behind me recently. I scanned the trees around me, listening hard. Nothing, just the wind and the faint creak of branches high above. I felt the weight of the silence pressing down again, and a strange thought crept in, that maybe I hadn't imagined that man on the trail. Maybe he had stepped off for a moment and followed behind me afterward. I picked up my pace, my pulse rising with every step. The trail began to slope upward, the last half mile before the parking area. My breathing was loud in my ears, and I kept glancing over my shoulder even though I didn't want to. Every time I looked, the trail was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally saw the glint of my truck through the trees, I almost felt relieved. The morning light had grown brighter now, casting thin beams through the forest canopy. I reached the truck, unlocked the door, and threw my pack into the passenger seat. Before climbing in, I turned around one last time to look back down the trail. The prints were there, 2 sets, mine and the ones that followed. They stopped right at the edge of the clearing where the truck sat. No sign of anyone else. Just those identical boot prints ending a few feet away from my bumper, facing directly toward where I stood. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time before starting the engine. The longer I stared down the trail, the more I realized how strange it all was. Whoever that person was, if it was a person at all, they had somehow known my exact route, my pace, my timing. They had followed right behind me, wearing everything I was wearing, down to the smallest detail. When I finally pulled onto the dirt road and drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror for miles, half expecting to see someone stepping out of the trees behind me. But the trail stayed empty, swallowed back up by the woods. I haven't gone back since. I still have the same boots and jacket, but every time I see them, I remember that morning, that quiet stretch of trail, the cold air, and the prints that matched my own all the way back to my truck. It wasn't a ghost story or some trick of the light. Someone was there. Someone who wanted to look exactly like me. And for at least part of that hike, they were only a few steps behind.